Welcome to the Quantum Biology Collective podcast, where we break down the practical strategies of this emerging science, starting with healthy light habits and going wherever the quantum superhighway takes us. This is your host, executive and life coach Meredith Oak, with a quick reminder that podcasts are conversations, not consultations, and definitely not medical advice. We're here for informational purposes only. To follow up with our amazing guests, please do check out the show notes. And to stay in the loop with the QBC podcast, join our email list, also linked in the show notes. All right, today we are going to talk about nobody's favorite topic, pain. And to take us on this journey, I have returning guest, Dr. Stephen Hussey. Stephen is a doctor of chiropractic, and he practices functional medicine as well. He's written 2 books that are great. They both look at health through an evolutionary perspective. The first one is The Health Evolution: Why Understanding Evolution is the Key to Vibrant Health. And then his other book is Understanding the Heart: Surprising Insights into the Evolutionary Origins of Heart Disease. So Dr. Hussey has a fascinating theory on the heart, and he says that it's actually more of a vortex than a pump, which, if you study quantum biology, makes infinite sense. We dive into that in our previous podcast, so the link's in the show notes if you want to go listen to that as well. Because today we look at pain, of course, through the evolutionary lens. That's what Dr. Hussey does. And he explains why pain is there, what its purpose is, what it does for us, why we, in many respects, need it, but also some surprising insights that he's gleaned on how to manage pain, really from a quantum perspective. Because what he has found is that coherence builds resilience, and resilience makes us less susceptible to deep pain. It's a really, really great conversation. And as always, Dr. Hussey has all of the research that he's very good at explaining in a way that all of us can understand. So please enjoy. All right, Dr. Stephen Hussey, so nice to have you back on the podcast. Okay, so we're going to talk about a topic today that, for better or worse, fortunately or unfortunately, touches all of our lives at some point, which is physical pain. I guess we could do a whole other podcast on other kinds of pain, but we'll focus on the physical kind.
Yeah.
So give us a little sort of background on what is actually happening in our bodies when we are experiencing physical pain, just from a generalized perspective, not even a quantum perspective, just how it's generally understood.
Yeah. So first I'll just give this kind of brief understanding of why is pain there? Why do we have this thing called pain? It's so uncomfortable. Why do we have this? And it's evolutionarily the body's way of signaling something is wrong. And if we look at, older evolved beings that have a nervous system and a pain response, like in invertebrates, they only have a sensory pain signal. Like if they encounter something in their environment that causes them pain, the only thing they know to do is get away from it. But they don't know, they don't learn to stay away from it.
Okay.
So they could encounter it lots of times and they just get away from it. And then, then we have higher evolved animals like vertebrate animals. So now we're talking about everything from a cat to an alligator or whatever. And they have, the sensory aspect. They feel something, senses, and causes them pain. But then they also have this emotional component to pain. And the emotional component is what makes them have a bad experience with that pain. It's what makes it emotional and them cry and have an issue with pain. That teaches them to stay away from it in the future. Right.
Okay. Right.
So now you can learn that this thing is painful or this experience is painful. We stay away from it. And then uniquely to humans, and maybe a little bit in animals that are closest to us, like chimps and things like that. But not nearly as much as humans, is this cognitive aspect of pain. And we have the ability to wonder about the pain. Why is it there? What does it mean for us? And that's because we have a very large prefrontal cortex that gives us cognition. And so that's mostly unique to humans, especially in the capacity that we do it. And so those things are very important to understand when it comes to why pain may be there. But then as far as the signaling of pain, so we have senses, and I could argue that there's more than five senses. But we have these senses, and anytime a sense is overstimulated or a tissue is damaged or something like that, because even if you get like a noise that overstimulates your ear, it's painful in your ear, but we mostly think of the sense of touch being overstimulated and we damage skin or something like that, or tissue. And that results in chemical changes in that tissue that send a sensory pain signal to your brain. Because the pain is not being, like when you cut yourself, like the pain is not there. And we've all had the experience, that you cut yourself, and you don't even realize it. And then when you realize it's there and you're like, oh yeah, and then it starts to hurt, right?
Yes.
But so you cut yourself, and the pain doesn't happen at that point. The body sends a signal through first order neurons to the spinal cord and through second order neurons to the brain. Once it gets to the brain, the thalamus, then that signals to the cortex areas of the brain that something has happened, send a pain signal back down so that you feel pain in that area, so that your body knows that it's there and protects it, right? And says, oh, or tends to it or something like that. And that's the sensory pain aspect. And that's, just as a side note, that's what opioids are trying to work on. They're trying to kill the sensory pain aspect of pain. And so now,
so when we take a painkiller, that's what
largely that's
an
what's
opioid
happening.
painkiller. Yeah. That's what it's interrupting that signal.
Right. There's other like anti-inflammatories or other less aggressive painkillers, I could say, that try and decrease inflammation, which inflammation is just low body charge. And that's like when the tissue is damaged, it interferes with the body's charge, and that, changes chemical signals, and that sends the sensory pain. But then there's the opioids that are trying to interfere with somewhere along that line, that signaling that's happening, so that it doesn't happen. But there are many issues with that, which we'll talk about. And then the cortical areas in the brain that send the sensory pain signal also communicate to the emotional pain centers, or the emotional centers of the brain, like the insular cortex and the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala and things like that. And there's lots of different emotional areas of the brain. So pain is not, there's not one direct pathway of pain from the cortical areas to the emotional centers, which is another reason why opioids won't work, because they're trying to block one thing. And it's really hard to try and block one thing when there's multiple pathways. So that engages the emotional centers of the brain, and that tells us, that makes us learn in the future, we had a negative experience with this stimulus and we should try and avoid it in the future. Could be as simple as, hand under hot water, something like that.
Yeah.
And then, but what is not accounted for oftentimes in Western medicine is that these cognitive areas of the brain can be over communicating to the emotional centers. And so we can create that pain signal from a sensory stimulus, overstimulus of our senses that communicate the signal that engages the emotional centers. But we can also do the reverse, in that we can overthink something. We can literally think our way into pain sometimes, and think our way out of pain sometimes, because these cognitive areas in our brain are connected to the emotional centers. And so they've actually shown that if someone gets an injury, a painful injury, and the amount of signaling between the prefrontal cortex and the emotional centers of the brain dictates whether or not, or predicts whether or not, that pain will become chronic pain. Because what you're doing is you're training the cognitive areas of the brain to communicate to the emotional centers and do like a almost backwards cognitive, emotional, then to the cortex that sends a sensory pain signal. So there may be no overstimulus of a sense or physical damage anywhere, but the cognitive areas of the brain are stimulating the emotional centers that trigger the sensory centers to send that pain signal. And so then we're getting into this, why we see such a heavy correlation between chronic pain and people with mental disorders, whether it's depression, anxiety, whatever it may be, because there's things about the brain that have changed in these people that are perpetuating this pain response. But it can work the other way as well.
Right.
So we can think our way out of a pain. So there's these really interesting experiments or early observations done by this guy named Henry Beecher, who was an anesthesiologist in World War II, and he was working on the front lines, and these soldiers were coming off the front lines with these terrible injuries. And he just started asking them, or just, he'd always ask them, but he just started taking note of, like, when he asked them, how much pain are you in? How much do you want pain medication? Those types of things. How much do you need? Or he started taking note of how much they asked for. And he just kind of kept that tucked away somewhere. And then after the war, he was back, I think, in Boston practicing, and he was asking patients that came out of surgeries the same questions. And what he found was that the soldiers coming out of war with these gruesome, uncontrolled injuries that were sometimes life-threatening were reporting way less pain and requesting less pain medication, whereas the people coming out of surgery were requesting way more medication, reporting much more pain. And his conclusions were that the soldiers were seeing this injury as a good thing because they were alive and leaving war and not having to go back to the front lines, at least until they healed, or maybe even indefinitely if it was a worse enough injury. And the people in the surgery were seeing this as a negative thing. Like, I had to have surgery. How's this going to affect my life? How is it going to affect my loved ones? Am I going to be able to do the things I need to do? So it was this, the
It's
way
the
they were thinking
opposite.
about
It's
it.
taking them out of a life they wanted to be in versus the injury getting you
versus
out of
away
a
from
war you
this
don't want to
terrible thing. Yeah.
Right.
So the way we think about it has an impact on how we see it emotionally, and that has an impact of what's signaled in the brain. So it can work both ways. Unfortunately, in the chronic pain epidemic that we're facing is more along the lines of the cognitive centers of the brain activating the emotional centers, causing a sensory pain stimulus with no physical damage whatsoever, or the physical damage is resolved and we're still having a pain signal because we've trained our brains to be that way. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. So I want to understand this a little more. So I'm just thinking back. I mean, so for me personally, I definitely the most intense pain I've ever experienced would be during childbirth, which is kind of an extreme example, but it's like, you see in the movies, like there's all those jokes where the husband's like, okay, now we're going to do our breathing. And the wife is just like, and it's a joke, but it's also real. Cause like in that kind of pain, it's almost like it, nothing else exists except that pain. And like, it can, like the rage is right there. Oh my God, like it is a intensely emotional experience. So what's happening?
Yeah. So, well, in that experience, like, pain is evolved to tell you to get away from it,
Right.
And in that experience, it's one where you can't necessarily. And so that is extremely frustrating, extremely emotional, because now it becomes something that your body's telling you evolutionarily to get away from, and you can't, which is crazy. So it's just extreme emotional experience. But that's also what's training you to stay away from that experience in the future if you can, right?
Right.
And so that's just the way it is. And they've actually, there are people who, unfortunately, it sounds weird, but unfortunately are born without a pain signal or ability to signal pain, and they don't live very long, because they have no feedback of how to avoid things in their environment of what causes pain. So they end up with lots of injuries, and they have no way to learn these things are bad, stay away from them. And so, but it's also just interesting to think about it too, in that, the emotional way, because you can have no physical pain whatsoever, but you could have emotional experience that is very painful, and we describe it that way. And it's because of these connections between the cognitive area and the emotional areas, because cognitive, we're thinking about this thing that happened to us and how terrible it is, and we have an emotional response to it, and we describe that as painful. And sometimes it actually can result in physical pain because, again,
Right.
we're training
That's
training
true.
it backwards, you know?
And we even talk about it that way. Like if someone gives you really bad news or tells you something you really don't want to hear, you like, oh, it was a gut punch, right? Like
Mhm.
you feel it physically.
Yeah, my heart hurts or something like that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's interesting too, because in the childbirth example, I did do training and we were given tools, and it's to frame it, right? And it's like, this is a temporary situation, and at the end there's a baby. And
Mhm.
so now I'm thinking about another kind, another type of pain. A few months ago, I'm still not exactly sure what happened, but something in my shoulder pinched up, and it was like excruciating. I just had to like lie on the floor and not move. And what I noticed again was, at first it's like, yeah, that really hurts, but whatever. But as it became clear that I wasn't sure or I wasn't able to make it stop, then all of the emotional pain started. And it's like, oh, how long am I going to be here? What did I do to myself? What's wrong with me? Like, this is, and then it was compounded with feeling really sad and feeling really depressed. And so I'm not surprised that there's a strong connection between chronic pain physically and being depressed, because it's actually really hard to not be depressed in that
Mhm.
situation.
Yeah, it's almost like the initial, like something pinches in your shoulder or you burn yourself or something like that. Like almost the initial response is almost like it's an emotional response, but it's like, I'm offended by that. Like,
Yeah.
how dare you hurt me? How dare you burn me? You know? And then yes, once it becomes something that you can't resolve, it becomes very frustrating and depressive, like that, as if it's a long-term sort of thing. But I think that it's important to differentiate, the cognitive and sensory types of pain, because someone could have chronic pain that is just a chronic sensory signal, right? Like you pinch your
Right.
shoulder um, or your shoulder gets degeneration in it or something like that, which doesn't always mean there will be pain, because there's plenty of studies that show degeneration in people and they say no pain whatsoever, or the area of pain is not where the degeneration is, because it all has to do with body charge. And so if you momentarily pinch that area in your shoulder, or the capsule gets pinched, or the ligaments, or you get a frozen shoulder, or um, different things like that, then what's happening there is there's some tissue damage. And that damage that happens interferes with the body's ability to hold charge there. And we know that a pain signal is sent when we have chemical changes, meaning changes in pH, pretty much. And a change in pH, basically, like, because we're supposed to have this kind of slightly basic pH as humans, or as a living thing. And so when we get low body charge, which means low electrons in that area, then we get more proton concentration, which becomes more acidic. And that's the signal for the nerve to send that signal to the brain, causing a sensory pain state. And so if that happens chronically, because we have some imbalance in our shoulder or our knee or something like that, that's causing this chronic chemical change in the tissue, then we get this chronic sensory pain signal with no emotional component to it, maybe yet, right?
Right.
Maybe over time it becomes that because we get frustrated with this knee pain or whatever.
Mhm.
But lots of times, despite the state of that knee, how much cartilage is in it, if there's degeneration in it or whatever, you can do things to increase charge in the body, increase that net negative charge that will get rid of it, or to make it go away. Right.
Mm.
So, and we, at least in the chiropractic world that I'm in, and other worlds, like, red light therapy was one thing that will increase body charge, or
Right.
grounding has been shown to increase body charge. And you do those things and it affects those types of pain.
Right.
And so that degeneration may be there forever. Who knows if it can go back to normal, but whether or not that's painful depends on how well you charge your body and affect that chemical change that's happening, that's telling your brain to have that pain signal.
Okay. So now we're getting into the quantum biologic aspect of pain. And
Mm-hmm.
so you just touched on it. So we're talking about, from a, a traditional or a typical overview of what causes pain. But now what you're saying is that the charge aspect is really important in terms of how we experience the pain. So are you saying that someone who's all charged up could have a similar situation physically to someone who's not, and the person who's not as charged will experience more pain?
Yes. Yeah. But if you get an injury that damages tissue, mitochondria can't maintain the charge as well. Potentially structured waters damage, which are things we can talk about. And those things interfere with the ability to hold charge in that area. Because of that direct damage, you feel a pain signal.
Okay.
If
But you
that
want to feel the pain signal because it's alerting you to the fact that something's happened.
Right. Yeah. And you want to pay attention to that area. You want to try and resolve it. If you can't, it's because you're chronically getting loss of signal, or loss of charge in that area, creating the pain signal. Right. And that's physical damage, right? That can turn chronic if there's potentially more damage, and then potential like chronic low body charge in that area, or chemical changes. And that's not necessarily quantum. That's understood in medicine. Like you get a chemical change, a change in pH, that's something that can signal that pain signal, or trigger that pain signal, right? But I understand it as low body charge, which they may not necessarily understand it as that. I understand it as a lack of the ability of the body to hold charge. And so yeah. But then, so lots of people have that type of pain. If you've got your chronic tennis elbow or whatever, those types of things. But other people have types of pain where there appears to be no physical damage to them, anywhere, but they have pain. And that's when I think that it could be a result of maybe people have had lots of physical injuries before in life, and they have lots of scar tissue and things like that. And that's when I think that this more cognitive aspect of pain develops for many reasons. Well, for two reasons. One being that the cognitive centers of the brain are communicating too excessively because they've been trained to do that to the emotional centers, and that's working backwards. And two, that...
Sorry, so just for that part, that's like if someone's really used to being in pain, that pain cycle, that pain communication cycle is so active that it doesn't take much to get it going.
Well, the brain is very plastic, and so it learns different develops different neuronal pathways that connect those areas, probably a little bit too much, right? More than they should be. And so then any sort of negative emotion or negative response to something from the cognitive side of things has the connection to the emotional centers that are also very well connected to the sensory pain centers that create a pain signal, even though there's no physical damage to me. Right. And that's this chronic pain thing that's happening. And I think that it's interesting. And I noted this in Robert Becker's book. There's a highlight in it. He found that the areas of the human body that are lowest in like predisposed to having lower charge are like the head, the upper back and neck, and the low back. And it's like,
that's where we are.
That's where
headaches,
we all get
backaches, shoulder, neck and
like
shoulder.
Everybody comes in. That's the most common areas of pain.
Yes.
Right. So it's like those areas, why they're a little bit predisposed to having a lower charge or whatever, I don't know. But that was just very interesting because, he was measuring charge in the body to see where he could regrow the limbs of the lizards and things like that.
Yeah.
So he was just measuring charge everywhere. And he's like, those are the areas that tend to hold the lowest negative charge, still a net negative, but lowest. So those areas are more prone to, when we have low body charge, have chronic pain. So yeah.
Okay.
But so you were two different types.
Okay. You were saying, and you were saying two things. And then I interrupted you to go deep on the first thing.
Yeah. So
the second thing.
Yeah. The first thing is that we can have been trained by past experiences, whether it's emotional or physical traumas or things, to have this connection between the cognitive centers, the prefrontal cortex pretty much, and the emotional centers of the brain. So pain is in the brain, not just in a sensory aspect, but from an emotional and cognitive aspect. But also we can get into a state where we can become incoherent, which we can talk about what that is, where the brain is getting signals to have that stress response all the time. And so that comes from the heart, and the ability of the body to be synced up and communicating as a whole. And if that is interfered with, which I'm sure we'll talk about why that can be interfered with, then it's almost as if your body's in a state of distress. And that can train the cognitive and emotional centers of the brain to be too connected once again. And all this, again, can come from past physical and emotional traumas, that puts a person in this state where their brain is just wired to create a pain signal because that's been the experience in the past. So yeah.
Wow. Okay. So what we're talking about there is people who are experiencing pain, even though there's no clear reason for it in a physical sense, or people who feel a lot of pain, even perhaps with something that's not technically very painful.
Yes. And most of the time it is because of past experiences. I think it would be hard to just develop this randomly, right? It's usually because someone has either had a lot of emotional trauma or physical traumas that have resulted in not only incoherence in the communication of the body, but also this hyper communication between the cognitive centers and the emotional centers in the brain. So yeah, like that's.
So those experiences can make us predisposed to have more pain in our lives.
Right, they can. However, it's very clear that if during those experiences, because again, during those experiences, if they've shown that while the pain is there, whether it's emotional or physical, and you have a reason for it to be because of this thing that happened to you, while it's happening, the amount of communication between the prefrontal cortex and the emotional centers dictates whether or not that pain will become chronic once it has resolved, right? Or once the injury has resolved, or the emotional trauma has quote unquote resolved. Like once those things have kind of been over and done with, if you during that time trained your brain to communicate the emotional and cognitive centers of the brain, then you will have chronic pain. But if you didn't, then you very likely won't have chronic pain.
And how is that determined, whether it's been trained or not?
So it's all about what they can do on functional MRI, brain scans, things like that, and what they're seeing in the communication there. But what dictates, I think it's what you're getting at, like what dictates whether or not they will think that way or not is basically their environment that they're in when they're experiencing this pain. Basically, the main one is how much support they have around them. People telling them that this is going to be fine, or we'll get through this, or whatever, or they just kind of left on their own, deal with this, get through it, and chronically worry about it the entire time. Basically, it's the worry, but if you have these reassuring stimuli that it's going to be fine, then it's very likely that you won't end up with chronic pain from those things. But just because you do end up with chronic pain doesn't mean that you can't change it.
Yeah.
And
back to the neuroplasticity,
right. Very, very plastic. It's just you have to be in the right environments. So.
Okay, so let's talk about what that looks like in terms of charge and coherence. Okay, so you just talked about what it looks like emotionally. And just as an anecdote, going back to the childbirth example, I have 3 children. I had I'm blanking on what it's called. Anyway, the thing where you don't feel anything.
Epidural.
The epidural, thank you. I had the epidural for 2 of them, and those were both hospital births. I had my middle child. I was, blessed enough to be in a place where we were able to organize a home birth and have incredible midwives who came, and I did not need an epidural. I couldn't get one. I was at home, but there was that emotional support there that you're talking about, right? And they're like, everything is going exactly the way that it's supposed to. You're doing great, blah, 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 you know, all of the things. And there was even one midwife there. I think one of the ones attending was newer. So for legal reasons, they needed an extra person in the room because she hadn't quite finished her training or whatever. So there was this super experienced woman who just got off an international flight, and she just needed to be in the room. She didn't need to do anything. And she was sitting in the corner of my bedroom with a blanket having a nap, right? And I was like giving birth. And I would see her out of the corner of my eye and I'd be like, how the heck is she sleeping through this? What is wrong with her? And then I had another thought, which was like, well, if she's so calm that she's having a nap, this really must be going fine. This really must all be normal. And it was so reassuring.
Yeah. And
totally changed my experience.
You know, compared to in the hospital when they're just like, okay, this is going to hurt. Right.
Yeah,
and
they're like,
we need to do this thing to make it not hurt.
Yeah.
You know, we need to make sure everything's okay. And, you know, it's just almost like, you know, they're preparing you for bad news.
Yeah.
Almost,
And it's like, oh,
you
and
know?
now this is how, oh, and now this is happening. Oh, we're going to have to do this now. And
Yeah. Which is
it's
just
true.
training your prefrontal cortex to worry. Right.
Right.
And that's super engaging to those emotional centers, creating the pain. You have more pain, right? Because you're almost prepared to have it because they're telling you it's going to happen, which very likely it will have some pain. But whether or not you have that support and reassurance and get through it has a huge impact on that. And it's not just with childbirth, it's with everything, you know, any sort of pain. So yeah, it's just very interesting how powerful that is. And then how, when you study that, you understand why people are in chronic pain. Because of not just them having the experiences of pain, emotional or physical, but how they were guided through it. And if they were guided at all through it. And also not just the emotional support, but the environment that they were in. As far as, you know, we talk about light or sound, or any of these, you know, more quantum aspects of things and how they affect us. I mean, I don't even know how to say his last name. Norman Doge, I think it was, wrote 2 wonderful books about neuroplasticity. And in the second one, he gives plenty of examples of people who he radically heals their brain for more than just pain things, using light and sound and energy, and things like this, electricity. Like the brain is very plastic. And so if we, I don't know, put ourselves in an environment that, like if we're experiencing an injury or an emotional hardship or whatever, and we put ourselves in an environment that encourages the plasticity of the brain not to become chronic, not to over-engage these 2 centers of the brain because of our environment, then it's way less likely we'll develop chronic pain going through that hard time.
Wow. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And Dr. Doge showed that pretty much, that that's the case.
Yeah. I'm remembering too, a parenting talk that I went to, and there was this woman, you know, telling us, she was great, telling us all this stuff. And, you know, the parent, there was a mom, there was Q&A time, and the mom was like, how do we like help our kids like not be traumatized, blah, blah. And she was like, listen, you cannot, and you don't want to stop your children from encountering trauma. That is part of life. What matters is how you respond when that trauma happens. And so
how do you teach them how to deal with it?
Yeah, exactly.
And put them in an environment that enables them to deal with it. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So that emotional component and making sure that we have at least someone in our life who is guiding us through the experience in a supportive way. Okay. So then let's talk about, when you say environment, the physical things that you mentioned, the light, the sound, all those things.
Well, first, I'll just explain coherence a little bit.
Yes.
Because that's going to become relevant when I talk about these other things. So coherence is, from my understanding and perspective, is when everything in the body is synced up and communicating as a whole so that they can unite in a response and do what's best for the system as a whole. The way I can explain it is like, so you have a company of 30 employees, and these employees are disgruntled. They're not happy with the company. They're not communicating with themselves very well. those types of things. If the company encounters a stress, it's very likely that it's not going to handle that stress very well because the people in the company are not working together very well. And if exactly the opposite, if the company everybody was united in a common goal for the company, they were being rewarded for their work, they were communicating very well, it wasn't a competitive environment, then that company encounters a stress, it's very likely the company is going to handle it very well and maybe even flourish, right? And so that's kind of coherence. And the body can get into a state where all the cells in the body are not communicating very well. And that can happen from sometimes these past emotional traumas or physical traumas. They can create scar tissue. And so the main way that can happen is a physical trauma obviously damages tissue, and the body tries to repair it very quickly, and it lays down collagen in a way that's not normal. And then that scar tissue that is developed is not very communicative as far as like,
because the body had to like rush it out.
Yeah,
because it's a wound or something, as opposed to
right.
doing the way it normally develops.
And the reason that is because the collagen is fascia, or the fascia is made up of collagen, and so the fascia is supposed to be hydrated with structured water, like this gel-like water that surrounds biological surfaces. And that's what makes the fascia able to communicate energetic information, protons, electrons, photons, phonons that communicate through the body. And it links every cell in the body, and the fascia goes all the way down to the level of the DNA. So every cell is be able to communicate in this way. If we get scar tissue, that fascia and that collagen is laid down so tightly that it's hard for water to structure itself on it as well. And so we lose that communication. And so now we get cells that may be less communicative, or areas of the body and tissue of the body that may be less communicative, and also have areas of the body that have lower charge. So we all know those knots in our back and our muscles that feel painful because they're scar tissue that's developed over time. They have lower charge. So not only are they contributing to this sensory pain aspect, they could be contributing to the inability of the body to communicate through the fascia from emotional.
So the body's communicating through the fascia, like as the quantum superhighway, as we call it, but the scar tissue is interrupting that communication. So it's
interrupting
like
it or slowing
the signals
it,
traveling along, and then it's like kind of gets garbled through the scar tissue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's more physical trauma. You can affect, the collagen proteins and that physical damage. But there's also emotional traumas that can be imprinted into the water in the body. Water holds memory, and so does fascia, actually. Fascia, once you get used to being a certain way, it's kind of resistant to change a little bit. You kind of have to force it to change. But the structured water in there can also hold these emotional traumas. And we know that Dr. Emoto has shown that when you express negative emotion to water, it doesn't freeze very well. It freezes differently. So that's interferes with the water's ability to connect and form more of a solid, so gel or ice. And so that's affects the communication as well, because the structured water on the fascia is very important for that communication. And so then when the body can't really communicate very well, we get incoherence. And the amount of past trauma or physical trauma or emotional physical trauma we get can create more and more incoherence, right? But there's also other things that can create it as well, because incoherence is not just the ability of your body to communicate within itself, but the ability to communicate within itself is also what dictates the ability of the body to communicate to other things outside of it. And so they've actually shown that cells, when they feel isolated, even if there's a cell right next to it, if it can't sense that cell because its communication pathways are broken down, whether it has poor mitochondrial health or damaged fascia there, then that cell acts like it's in distress, even though it's surrounded by other cells. And so if we lose the ability to communicate to our environment, which can happen if we're incoherent from the inside, that can also happen if there's other things interfering with our ability to communicate with other life on the planet, or connect to the ether, if you call it that, then we get this state of, we start acting very stressed, right? And that coherence is measured by the heart. The heart has an electromagnetic field that's larger than any electromagnetic field of any organ in the body. And it's the only organ that can touch or sense every cell in the body. And so when it's because it can do that, it's measuring how coherent the whole body is. And that is measured, or how coherent we are is measured through heart rate variability. It's measured through the heart. People think that heart rate variability is a measure of balance in the nervous system. And I don't necessarily think that anymore. I think that it's measuring coherence. And that coherence is being relayed to the brain, and the brain is sending coherent or incoherent signals through the nervous system that result in more sympathetic or parasympathetic dominance, or imbalance, right? So it's related, definitely, to autonomic balance, but I don't think it's what it's measuring exactly.
Interesting.
And so if we're getting that incoherent signal, the heart is picking up that signal, it's relaying that to the brain, nervous system wise and electromagnetically, and the brain is in this higher cognitive state of worry, right? Which we already talked about.
Yeah.
So it's not just the physical damage that's happening that's causing chemical changes, causing sensory pain signals. It's also the incoherence that it's creating, making you worry more, engaging those emotional centers and causing the pain signal the other way. And that has to do with how coherent your body is and how it's synced up and communicating as a whole, which is fascinating. And it just, like, this just shows why body work therapies work, because we affect the fascia. We start to create coherence, and like pretty much every body work therapy across the board has been shown to improve heart rate variability. Yeah.
So say a little more about that, of how the body work is. What is it doing to the fascia when you have a massage or you have a chiropractic adjustment?
So I think anybody familiar with body work or has been in body work for a while has heard stories of people, getting a massage or some sort of fascial work or body work, and all of a sudden the person they're working on or whatever has this emotional recollection, and they either start crying or laughing or something like that, because we know this trauma, this emotional experience has been stored in the tissue. And if it's a muscle and you have to be working on that muscle, it can be released. And unfortunately, it can happen in organs and things like that, which are harder to work on because they're more internal. But there are different types of therapies that have been developed by people that take into account the body part of it. So this is really fascinating stuff. So like, I've found, specifically with chiropractic, because I've looked into that a bit more, but pretty much all bodywork therapies are likely to have these effects. But with a chiropractic adjustment, when you adjust someone's spine, you're creating a piezoelectric effect in the tissue. Like when you compress or stretch a tissue, it has a piezoelectric effect. It literally creates electrons, electricity pretty much, that are communicated through that fascia network instantaneously throughout the rest of the body. So that piezoelectric effect rearranges collagen. It kind of provides a stimulus. You can kind of think of it as like almost like a shock, to it. And that rearranges it so that it can lay down more spaced out so that water can structure itself around it. So it does that. It emits light in the form of infrared heat when you get an adjustment. It emits sound, which I think most people are familiar with. When you get an adjustment, you hear a sound. And it emits electromagnetic field, sort of. And all those things are taken. So not only are we rearranging the scar tissue, which is helpful for increasing the communication of the body, but we're also creating energy that is communicated through that fascia to the rest of the body. And, specifically to chiropractic, when we adjust the spine, I think it's no mistake that the melanin in the nervous system, which is known as the pigment of our skin, melanin is what gives us the tone of our skin. But it's also concentrated in the nervous system and lots of other places in the body. But it picks up that information because melanin can receive all these forms of energy and convert it into electrons pretty much, by breaking apart a water molecule, which the spinal cord is surrounded by cerebral spinal fluid, water, and the brain is surrounded by it too. So I think there's really no mistake that it's like that. that the brain is surrounded by this fluid, and you have these effects that create energy. And, there's one researcher in particular that claims that most of the energy for the nervous system comes from the breaking up of water in the cerebrospinal fluid. And if we give it that energy, then we're increasing coherence, right? Not just by affecting the nervous system, which lots of chiropractors think we're affecting we are affecting the nervous system, but we're also affecting coherence of the body. So it's coming the other way. So not only are the nervous system is what I think the nervous system is just the communicator. It's just the messenger. It's receiving signals from the environment, and whatever it's receiving, then it's communicating that to the body. Right. But with the effect on coherence that bodywork therapies have, we're not just affecting the ability of the messenger system to work, like with a chiropractic adjustment, take pressure off spine. We're also affecting the environmental signal that the body is getting by increasing coherence, by breaking up that scar tissue, giving the body energy, allowing for better communication. So it's kind of working both ways. And then here's the real fascinating thing, is that there's this guy, I can't pronounce his name, but he did this work with amputees, and they were having phantom limb pain, pain in the limb that wasn't even there anymore. And what he did was he did these tricks with mirrors, so it made it look like, according to that person's brain, that the limb was still there, by reflecting the other limb that was still there on that one. And when they did that, they could work on the limb that was still there, but it looked like it was the amputated limb, and they could work on that limb and resolve their phantom limb pain. So what that means is
so crazy.
Yeah, what that means is that the body, this just shows the importance of body work. The body is required to rewire the brain, because as far as that's, and it also just shows that pain is in the brain, because the pain is being created in the brain, even though there's no physical body part there. You're feeling it because your brain still has the center and the area of the brain that encodes for that body part is telling it to have pain. And in order to get it to go away, you had to have that body part to work on. Right?
Whoa, this is crazy. But yes, but to your point earlier about creating pain where there's no physical trigger for it, this would be an extreme example of that.
Yeah,
so
that could
is
happen.
it them? So their brain was experiencing the body work as though it was actually happening, because it was actually happening.
It was actually happening
But
to
they
the other
were
limb.
experiencing it as though it was happening to the limb that was no longer there.
Right. So they, even though that they have sensory pain signals in that limb, the brain, the eyes were seeing it happen to a limb that wasn't supposed to be there, but it was because of the way they situated the mirrors. And that had enough of an effect that it allowed them to rewire the brain to stop having pain in that signal or that area of the brain of the body that wasn't the part that wasn't there anymore. So that's how impactful
There's
body
so
work
many
can be.
things I love about that, right? Like starting with the fact that practitioner took that person's pain seriously. Right? Like they weren't just like, well, you don't have a leg there, sir. Obviously this is in your head, like take a pill, right? It was like, he took it seriously. It meant something, and he treated it from that point of view going forward, which anyway, and then came up with this ingenious way for the person to have the experience that they needed to have.
Yeah. And so what that shows is, because that's where we started this coherence conversation, was like, how do we fix the pain? Right. So if it's a chronic sensory pain signal, it could be as simple as, relieving the stress that's causing the pain signal, or increasing body charge enough that it stops the pain signal from happening. If it's more of a cognitive aspect of pain where the brain's been wired, we have to change the brain. Right. And that can be done through body work, because it's sending more coherent signals. We stop worrying so much, and those pain signals eventually go away, or they're not as robust anymore. But like I was saying earlier, people with these cognitive, types of pain are way more likely. There's a much higher chance of success if our environments are in a way that encourages less worry, right? And so then we're thinking about all the things that create stress and all the things that have been shown to about our modern environment. So we think about,
Right.
is your circadian rhythm totally wrecked?
Yeah.
That's not going to send a very good signal,
Right.
helping you get past that,
Because
right?
that comes to a point that what I really wanted to get into next. It's like you go to the body worker, you have all of these beautiful effects happen from the body work. And then what? And then you go home and then what environment are you putting your body into?
Right. And then a month later, you're like, oh,
Okay.
gotta go get another massage, right?
Yeah.
Because it's back,
Right.
right? So,
And you're back to needing it as much as you did that other time, because in between we've gone back to a place of incoherence. Okay.
yeah. Well, and that's something that chiropractors, at least if they're, familiar with the history of chiropractic, BJ Palmer and DD Palmer, the father and son founder of chiropractic, like they would talk about these miracles they saw all the time. They would adjust people's spines and just have this person was like, has this miraculous cure or whatever, or it would take a few adjustments or a few months, something like that. And we're not seeing that these days, or at least I don't, because it's like, how many more things is this person's body dealing with once we give it the adjustment, right?
Right.
So yeah, the electromagnetic environment, the light environment, the food environment, the emotional environment, what kind of home are they going back to, all these different things. These where we talk about this quantum aspect of stuff and how these things affect us and our ability to have coherence and turn off that worry that's keeping those centers of the brain communicating too much. And if we do that, now there are people that unfortunately have what researchers call this learned helplessness.
Yeah.
And they've shown that you can train this in animals in some very cruel experiments, but it can happen. And if you're in a system that keeps giving you solutions that aren't working, right, then you learn helplessness. You learn there's nothing that can help me. And I experience this day in and day out. People say, I've been everywhere, nothing's going to help. And I'm always reminded of this story I heard in school where it was like, the doctor was like, or this guy comes to the doctor and explains his pain, explains he's been through it every therapy and he's tried everything, nothing's going to work. And the doctor says, I think I can help you with your pain. Let me give you this, or let's try this therapy. And the guy says, I just don't think it's going to work. It sounds great, doc, but I just don't think it's going to work. And the doctor was like, well, let's give me 3 weeks, let's just try it. I'll do it half price or whatever. And the guy says, no, I just don't think it's going to be worth my time. It's not going to work. Nothing's worked. And the doctor says, I think I can help you with your pain, but I fear it may leave you with nothing left to talk about. Because some people have learned this helplessness and also, unfortunately, may be getting some positive emotion or positive attention from that they fear they may lose if they correct their problem. And so these are, again, brain changes that are very real in people, and we have to be aware of them when we're helping people with chronic pain. But I think that the more the solutions we give them can be empowering, like go home and optimize your circadian rhythm and, decrease your electromagnetic field exposure and change your diet, like all these different things are empowering, because it's not like I'm not dependent on these people that give me these treatments that don't end up working. It's I can make changes. And they may not be ready to hear that. They may not go home and do it, but like those are the things that we have to keep pushing for them. And maybe they need to hear it 5 times before they start doing it. There's got to be a first. So tell them. Right.
Yep.
And so
you might be the seed planter, not the harvest reaper,
but that's the environment you have to put them in to
Yeah.
give them a chance to start changing their brain again. And like I said, there's neurologists that have done some absolutely fascinating things with light and sound, electricity that change people's brains. These are people that have debilitating cognitive conditions, like way past just chronic pain. And they can change their brain and have significant impact on their life. So their brain can change. And that's what we should be focusing on in pain, is how do we change the brain? Not just block a pain signal, but how do we change the brain?
Yes, absolutely. Because blocking the signal, you're going to be dependent on whatever it is you're using to block the signal.
Well, yes. So that is But there's some really interesting experiments done in the 70s and 80s. I forget the guy's name, but he basically designed these experiments with genetically identical rats, and he put one set of rats isolated in lab cages,
Mm-hmm.
and then he created what's called a rat park, is what he called it. And he put like a bunch of rats in the same area, males and females, gave them
Oh,
toys,
I've heard this guy.
right?
Yeah,
And he
this is
gave them a
amazing
natural
research.
environment.
Yeah,
And he also gave each group unlimited access to morphine.
yeah,
And the rats in the cages quickly became addicted,
yeah.
because they were isolated on their own. And the rats in the rat park, they tried sometimes, but they never became addicted. They definitely never got to the point where like the rats in the cages did, like they started ignoring food and eventually died of starvation because they were so hooked on this drug. But that suggests that it's not the drug that's super addictive. It's the escape the drug gives you from your life
Right.
that's so addictive.
Back to the escaping war
Right.
story. Right.
Right. So
It's
they're
like if
escaping war and
I
they saw
have
it
a
as a good
life that
thing.
I don't need an escape from, I'm
I
probably
don't,
not going to become addicted to opioids.
right. And so and unfortunately for some people, it's not a reality they can do. They can't, just quick change their life like that. And that's something we have to be cognitive of. But for
Mhm.
some people, rather than this thing that just gives you this temporary escape, and it doesn't have to be a strong opioid drug. We use things to escape all the time. It
Mhm.
could be alcohol, it could be sex, it could be excessive vacations, it could be anything that we use to escape.
Shopping.
Shopping, yeah, like, and those are
Yeah.
all like minor versions.
Mhm.
But people who are, I don't know, have a really tough life, they're more likely to become addicted to these things, quote unquote addicted, because of the complete escape that it gives you. And it's once you have
Yeah.
that extreme of an escape where you're literally um shutting out life, then it's hard to recreate that any other way. But the more you do it, the more you create this life that changes your brain and is rewarding to you through all these things we're talking about, life and or light and energy and all these types of things, then the less likely you're going to want to need those things. And I'll never forget the day a patient walked into my clinic and said, I want to start seeing a chiropractor. And I said, oh yeah, what's going on? He was like, well, I've suffered with chronic pain a lot in my life. I used to be addicted to opioids, but I kicked them. And um, and he said, many of my family members are still addicted to opioids. And he said, they don't work. He said, they just mess you up so much you can't think about the pain. And I
Mm.
said, that's exactly how they work, because we're shutting down the prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
which is just back to what we originally started talking about.
Right.
Right. And that guy was, kudos to him. He was out like counseling people and helping them get off opioids and things. But like, we don't need this complex science. This guy who had no medical
Yeah.
training whatsoever knew exactly how it was
He's
working,
like, yeah,
and he just told me, and I was like, you're exactly right.
that is exactly what's
They
happening.
don't
Yeah.
work. They just shut you off. They just turn off your brain. They have to make them
Yeah.
so strong that they do that. That's the only way they can work.
Wow. And that's also what you were saying too. And I think where I read about the Rat Park research was in relation to recovery communities from addiction, right?
Mhm.
Where when you are, again, you're in a supportive environment, you're surrounded by people who believe you can do it because they've done it themselves. They're giving you tools to think differently. You feel a part of something, and you're meeting all of these needs and creating coherence. So the effect that was provided by whatever alcohol or drugs or whatever it was becomes less necessary.
Or doesn't compare to the life you've created.
Yes,
Right. So like
indeed.
the solution is, change your environment. And like most of that is going back to nature more, like, because that's why we're in this state where our bodies can't communicate. It's because we've lost this contact with nature. And so go back to nature. And then once you get there, create a life you don't want to escape or don't need to escape. Maybe you want to sometimes because you want to go on vacation. Maybe you want to go see Spain or something like that, but you don't need to, right? Your life is good there. So that's no matter what you're struggling with, whether it be pain or anything else, like
Yeah.
That's kind of this summing up, way of thinking about it.
That's beautiful. And let's end on that. Let's just talk about nature, right? So we talked about a lot of different ways to create coherence. And you talked about circadian rhythm and light. And so nature, so if we follow nature, we get all of those things. So from, if you could just explain, like, how does going outside help with our coherence?
Well, we can make energy. So from a sensory pain aspect and a charge, like low body charge, like put your feet on the earth and get sunlight on your skin. Your body is taking electrons from the earth and it's converting sunlight in many different ways to electrons in your body. That's increasing body charge, right? And that's the way
Right.
that humans have been forever until very recently. And it's supposed to be that way. We're supposed to gain this charge. It's like, plants are always plugged in and out in the sun. We humans have to go and charge up our batteries, and then we can be removed from them for a while, but we have to go back and recharge. We're rechargeable batteries. And the light is going to build the structured water, which is what holds our charge. It's the main, like, structured water is electronegatively charged. It holds that charge for us. It allows us gives us more capacity to charge our battery, right? And so staying hydrated with minerals and then putting yourself in those environments to create charge. And then you're also more in contact with the Schumann resonance and the ether, the thing that we're all connected through, right? When you're out in nature, rather than being in this electrosmog of electromagnetic fields that's interfering with your body to communicate to, the ether and then therefore other living things. So you got to think about those rats in the cage feeling isolated. If you go out into an environment where you can connect to other things, like, you don't feel as isolated, even if you are alone, right?
Right.
You hear stories about, like, um, Henry David Thoreau going out into nature, and how rewarding it was for him, and how he was able to be on his own somewhat, because he was probably still connected to the ether. He could sense people, or other living things around him. Doesn't mean that he didn't need contact with people sometimes, because we do need that for sure. But you hear about all these writers and people that go into nature and find themselves, or whatever, and that kind of stuff. And then, yeah, just typically nature has less of those things that interfere with your body's ability to connect, and also less toxins that interfere with, structured water formation and those types of things. And so we're also going to be getting, probably the big one, more in touch with sunlight and the natural cycle of the sun, which is incredibly, you think about it, like, if you're woken up in the middle of the night and forgotten where you were for a second, and it took you about 10 seconds to think, oh yeah, it's Thursday and I got to do this today, or whatever. If your body doesn't know what time it is, because it doesn't know when it's light out and when it's not, and what time, like, where the sun is, where you have artificial light, then it's kind of like your body's waking up in that middle of the night, not knowing where it is. It doesn't know what time it is. And that's stressful to the body, to not know what to do and when to do it. Because if you continued to not know what time it was, you'd be like, oh my gosh, what do I have to do today? You'd be really stressed. And so if it's constantly like that, that's a problem. And so that's something else that nature does for us, is it tells us what time it is, what season it is, all these different things. So all that environment, and you can get all complicated with it and how it affects the biology and the biochemistry and the biophysics of the body, and how that has the effects that we want on the brain. But it's really that simple. Like, just nature does these things. So as much as you can in your modern way of life, incorporate these things, because we can't just go live in the woods anymore. Most people can't. So it's about using tools that you can reconnect with nature, whether it's going out into nature more. But then if you can't, you can use, grounding tools indoors, or infrared saunas, and just different things that help us mimic, the nature. Remove the EMFs and things like that to help your home mimic nature a bit more. All those different things. And you could go on and on.
Beautiful. Yeah. And so, and then bit by bit, we're building a coherent world for our bodies and for our whole beings to live in.
We're putting ourselves in an environment that's allowing the body to do that. Yes.
Right.
by not, and that's an old, I'm not very chiropractic philosophical or whatever, but that's an old, like, chiropractic thing. Remove the interference, what they'd say.
Yes.
There's subluxations interfering with the nervous system. Remove the interference and let the body heal itself. So it's just like remove the things that are interfering with your contact with nature, and let the body figure it out, because it will, right? And then sometimes we can get into states because of things that happen to us or modern ways of life that need a more concentrated dose of things. And so there's people who are discovering tools that really are just concentrating nature's doses into us that have had these profound impacts on our physiology. So,
oh, so amazing, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This was super fun. As usual, I learned so much. And how can people find you? We'll put it in the show notes, but just let them know.
My website is resourceforhealth.com. And I'm on social media, just Dr. Stephen Hussey. My books are on Amazon. If you don't want to use Amazon, then you could go to the publisher website, which is Chelsea Green. My heart book is up there, and I just wrote another book. And so I'm working on getting that out there. That has a lot more to do with what we just talked about. So
great.
for that in the coming year or so.
Oh, fantastic. We'll have to do another episode when you're ready
Yeah.
to launch that one. Yes. And in the meantime, I do definitely recommend we have another episode with you on the heart, and your book on the heart is fascinating. It will help people rethink the heart as much as we've just rethought pain.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Woohoo! You made it to the end of another episode. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploratory adventure into new realms. Your energy and support are building a different world, and I am so grateful to be on this journey with you. Take care, and thanks.